Hello, welcome to Where the Bush is Burning. I'm your host, Tom Tice, and we're going to spend a little time today looking into the scriptures and have a conversation about Christ. Now, where we're going today is something that happened on the day that Christ rose from the dead. Now, before we talk about this incident, it's probably a good thing for us to have a conversation about Christ's resurrection from the dead. Truth to tell, it's one of the most well attested to facts in history. The people who did see him wrote it down. They gave their written testimony that they had seen him alive from the dead. And there were a number of incidences that speak of him as having risen from the dead. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all mention it. The Apostle Paul, and you may want to have a look at this, looking in 1 Corinthians, has quite a lot to say about the resurrection of the dead, most particularly Christ's resurrection from the dead. He says that the apostles saw him, that he was seen of above 500 people at one time, and there were other occasions when people saw him alive from the dead. So the resurrection of Jesus Christ became one of the main themes of the writing and the preaching of the apostles in the New Testament era. So the resurrection of Christ is critical to what we believe. And the story that I'm going to talk about today, and I want to tell you, has to do with Christ's resurrection from the dead and appearing to two men. Now, one of these men's name was Cleopas. The other, we're not told who he was. But after Christ had risen from the dead, they were on their way back to a place called Emmaus. So they were walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Now, they were not aware that Christ had risen from the dead, although they'd heard stories about it. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But what happened was they were walking along the road to Emmaus from Jerusalem. And as they did, Luke says that Christ drew near to them and began to walk with them. Now, they weren't able to recognize him for one reason or another. And so he began to question them, asking them why they were sad and what caused them to be so disconsolate. And they responded by saying, are you a stranger in Jerusalem and you haven't heard? And then they started to tell him about Jesus was the prophet, mighty in word and deed, and that they thought that he was going to be the Messiah, and that he had been taken and crucified, and that it had been several days since this had happened. So Christ then begins to talk to them, and he starts with kind of an aggressive sort of a line. He says, "O fools, and slow of heart to believe everything that the prophets have written." And then he goes on to say, wasn't it necessary for Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory? And then it makes a very important statement. And the statement that it makes is one that we want to consider very carefully today. It says that beginning at Moses and the prophets, he declared to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Now, consider what that involves. What he's saying there, what Luke is saying there, is that Christ began with Moses, who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, and all the prophets, and that he declared from them and also through all the prophets, through all the scriptures in the Old Testament, the things concerning himself. So, this is important for us to understand, because here is Christ preaching himself. Now, we talk about the preaching of Christ, and it's an important thing. Here we see Christ setting the standard for how he is to be preached, and that it is, in this particular case, as this was all they had, out of the Old Testament. So he began with Moses, and he went to the prophets, and in all the scriptures he preached to these two men the things concerning himself. That's important, because you're going to encounter people who are going to be talking about the Bible, and sometimes they like to say that they're very Bible-centered, or they like to say that they're very strong on the scriptures. Well, here's what you want to remember. When Christ took the scriptures in hand, he preached about himself, and he preached about himself entirely out of the Old Testament. Now, that's not to say that the New Testament doesn't have ample places, number of places for us to preach Christ. There's a lot of places in the New Testament, but when Christ had the opportunity, he took the whole of the Old Testament, Moses, the prophets, all the scriptures, and he preached to these two men the things concerning himself. Now, this is important because if you're like me, you probably read the Bible from time to time. Maybe you read it consistently, maybe you read it every day, and you look through it. Well, I would challenge you that Christ is to be found in the Old Testament, and to be found quite regularly in the Old Testament, because when Christ took the opportunity to tell these men about himself, he used Moses, the prophets, and the whole of the scriptures of the Old Testament. So I would say if you are going to read the Bible, you should look for Christ in the Old Testament. Now, he's there to be seen. He's there in types. He's there in shadows. He's there in what we call Christophanies, that is pre-incarnate appearances of Christ. If you watched any of the videos that we've put out previously in Where the Bush is Burning, you will realize that we talk about Christ, we have conversations about Christ out of the Old Testament and also out of the New Testament. So he's there to be found. And I would encourage you, as you read the scriptures, to look for Christ in the scriptures. As you listen to anyone who professes to be a preacher or who professes to be Bible-based, well, how much does that individual set forth Christ before you? Is he able to get to Christ, to speak of Christ out of the Old Testament and out of the New Testament, because he's there to be found? Now, as Christ walked along with these men, they got to the place where they were going there in Emmaus, and he sort of made motions like he was going to go on farther, and they asked him to come in and sit down with them and eat bread with them. And so as they gathered together in the house, breaking bread, Christ took the bread, broke it, began to bless it, and as he did, the eyes of the two men were opened, and he vanished out of their sight. So this was an exciting experience for them, because they did not realize, they'd heard tales that Christ had risen from the dead, but they of course hadn't seen him and weren't aware of who this person was who was walking along the road with them. And yet Christ revealed himself to them at that moment, and then he vanished out of their sight. Well, they were so excited, they got up in the very hour and they went back to Jerusalem to tell the rest of the disciples that were there that they had seen Christ raised alive after he had been raised from the dead. They'd seen the resurrected Christ. So a very, very significant event in their lives, a very significant event in the history of Christ's post-resurrection appearances. This is one of the first of his post-resurrection appearances. What I want us primarily for our own benefit to get out of this is this: Christ is in the Bible. He's there from the beginning to the end. And when Christ set the standard, if you will, for preaching, he picked up Moses, the prophets, the whole of the scriptures of the Old Testament, and he preached himself out of the Old Testament. We know that Christ is we can preach Christ out of the New Testament. And when we hear anyone who proclaims to be Bible-based or talking about the Bible, the question that you want to ask, when you hear them speak, how much of Christ is there in what they have to say? How quickly can they get to Christ? How much of Christ can they show me? It's important because Christ is the primary individual that God would have us see from the beginning of the scriptures to the end. So think about that as you contemplate the person of Christ. I'm glad you've decided to listen to this or watch this conversation about Christ today. I hope that you get benefit from it. I hope you find it encouraging. We would love for you to like the video. We'd love for you to subscribe to Where the Bush is Burning. Make sure your settings are set properly so that you can get notifications, and share this with your friends, and continue, if at all possible, to participate with us here. We're having conversations about Christ. He's an exciting person. It's enjoyable for us to have these conversations. I appreciate all of you who have responded and said how much you are glad for this YouTube channel. I hope it does you good and continues to point you to Christ. So come back another time and we'll have another conversation about Christ. Thank you for watching today. We appreciate you.